coming by. Hope everyone's feeling okay. You're feeling nice after lunch. How's just going to do a little bit of like energy checking. How's people feeling in the room? People energy. Are you after siesta? Have you taken siesta? Yeah. Okay, nice. Clara will be holding the space today. Hopefully, a very interesting chat discussion about coffee. If you don't have coffee, we can about um, and we don't need coffee if anyone wants to do some reproduction for the feminist movement. Actually, this is your time. But yeah, we am here with Marga and I for activists from Kala, the feminist engaged for Latin Americans, and Elif, a Kurdish activist, writer, editor, creator, translator, big person, big person in the table. And I guess we're here on the Azadî Transnational Feminist session, used to bring back some reflections, some buildings, some growings that have been developing over the last couple of years, especially after a conference called Women Living Future that happened in Berlin last year that was organized by the Kurdish women's movement, and that brought back this reflection of what does a transnational political project looks like and what does it mean to comment and start thinking from a transnational perspective and a vision when we do politics in our territories. So hopefully that's interesting for all of you. And I guess like this is a relevant session to hold in a stage like this after the last long cycle of the struggles and feminist struggles in the last couple of years since the feminist strike in 2018 that have set up a new wave of of yeah struggles and alternatives being built. I'm going to pass on the mic to Ellie. We are going to do a little bit of a framework of what the genocide means, what does it mean to talk from the Kurdish feminist movement, and then Farah will be doing their contribution. Hopefully, we'll be just building between each other. And this is like, yeah, as I said, more a conversation than anything else. So we will also be having questions at the end.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you very much for being here today. I know there's a lot of competition because there's a lot of things on the program. I guess we thought it would be quite important to have a session around Jiyan Azadî, because a lot of people have probably heard the slogan for the first time in the last year. And of course, there's many people who would have been, would have known about it or would have been engaged with particularly the ideas behind it for much longer. But one of the why I think it's very important to be talking about Jiyan Azadî and particularly the background, the history, and perhaps the vision of it is because at the same time, seeing the kind of, I guess, spread and the rise of this, what has actually only been deemed a slogan, we've also seen the, I guess, quite expected actually, co-optation, the hollowization, I suppose we can call it, of this slogan as well. And so I'll start by saying Jiyan Azadî, which translates to woman, life, freedom, is of course, a very beautiful and catchy slogan, but importantly and crucially, it's a political declaration of the Kurdish women's movement that has been developed over decades of struggle, of resistance, and of very serious thinking and developing ideologically and politically. And as far as we know, and the reason why I say as far as we know is because the history and the story of the Kurdish women's movement is a very alive one. It's still being written, it's still being lived, it's still being developed. But as far as we know, the slogan was first chanted on the streets of Istanbul on the 8th of March 2006, and it was as a declaration, particularly post 2005, when Abdullah Öcalan was able to get some of his prison writings out of the Imrala prison, declaring the ideas of democratic confederalism, which is a radical democratic alternative for the Kurdish people's struggle for freedom that is based on the principles of radical democracy, women's liberation, and ecology. So responding also to that alternative being kind of presented to the world, and also building of years of struggle and already years of discussions around alternatives to the state, alternatives to of course, well, patriarchy, or not necessarily alternatives to it, but an anti-patriarchal approach that already being developed and integrated into the way Kurdish women were struggling within actually their own society, but also against their occupiers, namely Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So the way the Kurdish women's movement kind of treats each 8th of March is to declare a new phase of struggle. So in 2006, the declaration of Jiyan Azadî was firstly for it to be chanted on the streets with other women, with women of other movements, other struggles, other peoples, and also to declare the vision of radical democracy, ecology, and women's liberation to the world. So, and from that, especially since 2006, every year has been a different phase of struggle, you know, from, for example, sometimes it's been, you know, talking about, you know, what the Kurdish women's movement calls like phases of rupture sometimes, which is you know, kind of sometimes societal political rupture, to then also build a new. In recent years, the declaration has included very strongly the visions of World Women's Democratic Confederalism, which we'll certainly get into a little bit later. But why I think it's very important to understand that the Jiyan Azadî has such a rooted history is because you know, when it was chanted in East Kurdistan, so northwest Iran, last year, following the brutal murder of Jina Amini, you know, many people said, you know, this is the first, you know, feminist revolution. This is the first feminist uprising. Now, of course, what was happening there and is still happening there is very inspiring, very important. It's a very brave uprising, of course. But I think what's important to understand is that it is also not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that Jiyan Azadî was being chanted on the streets of Kurdistan in northwest Iran and also in other parts of Iran. It's not a coincidence that, you know, already the people rising up were understanding their uprising and their struggle as connected to other parts of Kurdistan. And I think that's really important to also declare, because there has also been an effort to kind of disconnect the struggle of of Kurdish people in different parts of Kurdistan. So I think it's very important to understand that connectedness, but also understand how a lot of people, even though there's been a lot of effort of co-optation of, you know, particularly trying to integrate the slogan of Jiyan Azadî, particularly into, you know, like liberal capitalism, which again we'll get into a little bit more a little bit later. Even though that has also existed, there's also been a very, you know, beautiful ways in which connections have formed following the uprisings last year as well. You know, the connection with particularly the other peoples within the current borders of Iran, you know, the Balochis, the other Afghani communities that are also in Iran, and other, you know, minorities within Iran. There's definitely been a stronger connection there. And also certain democratic sections of ethnically Iranian people as well have also been able to create connections. And you know what a lot of us said when the uprisings happened last year is it's very important to stay tapped into what the people are struggling for. And you know, many voices came out. Obviously, there's like, you know, the Khomeini supporters in Iran, there's the Shah supporters like that want to reinstate the monarchy and so on. It's very important that, you know, the history of how Iran got to where it got to is understood, but also what the people within those current borders want, and also how they are connecting to other parts of the region as well. So Jiyan Azadî, therefore, wasn't just a coincidental slogan that people decided to chant when the uprising started at the funeral of Gina Amini. But it was a very conscious declaration of understanding that that is what they want for the future of Iran. And as hopefully the starting of a process that, you know, may have its ebbs and flows, but will mean that eventually we can see a more democratic, more free, more women's liberationist region as a whole, you know, connected with the struggle in Rojava, connected with the struggle in you know, North Kurdistan, Southeast Turkey, connected with struggles in other parts of the region, and connected with the struggles of revolutionary women in Afghanistan as well, and other parts. So I think I'll leave it there because I wanted to set the tone a little bit about like why Jiyan Azadî is a political declaration. It's a part of a revolutionary method for freedom and not just a feel good, you know, feel good 3 words.
Nice, thanks for that. I think it's really interesting as well when we're talking about transnational feminism to think about like what the slogans mean beyond beyond just the word. What does it mean in the context and in the contextualization, in the background, the history, and the politics of the movement in that territory. And it was a good framework. And I think like that can also relate to like the struggles in Latin America, where we've been seeing slogans coming back and being reiterated and being reinterpreted and being recontextualized also in the West. So I guess like I'm interested a bit from like learning a bit more like from this movement, but also learning a bit of like what does it mean to do transnational organizing in a way that you are also loyal to the original meaning of what the slogans in the politics that originate from the movement and that can then be translated. I mean, yeah, exactly. I could put that on the table as a prompt.
Is it helpful for me to maybe start by responding to what it was like to, I guess, encounter the Kurdish like women's movement across the Women Leaving Future conference? So I think all of what you said is really amazing because I think encountering this framework as Fala, like we're fairly, even though we've been doing this for 3 years, the Feminist Assembly of Latin Americans, I think, you know, we were kind of born in the UK, but with like a foot in like all of the territories that we bring with us. And it was really amazing. This is like the first kind of time we like traveled outside of the UK to encounter other groups outside of this specific territory. And we were encountering groups from Abya Yala, from Latin America, but also across Europe and across like all across the world. And it was really amazing because a huge takeaway for us was this like incredible concerted strategic effort to organize a movement on a global scale. And I think being born in this territory, being in an independent movement, it's really easy at times to convince yourself that you're like a fringe group holding marginal problems, even within leftist spaces. But being in such close contact with like truly revolutionary organizing that at its center really has youth and women-led movements, really asks yourself to take yourself and your organizing really seriously. And it actually demands that we become really ambitious and insistent about the perspectives of women, migrants, and marginalized genders and what these voices can bring to revolutionary conversations. So being like in contact with the Kurdish women's movement made us hugely aware of the importance of the struggles that we bring with us from our territories, being migrants, being in the UK, and how these experiences and these struggles should be made central to all political work that we're involved in, not just small kind of like feminist interventions in the labor movement. Like that's really not enough. I think if these perspectives aren't being made central to how politics are being made, we're not going to get anywhere. And I think that's something that really came across from encountering the Kurdish women's movement. And I think connecting to that space really made it important for us to understand that this community-led approach that Bella was taking was really important, that we shouldn't abandon it. I think existing in a context where feminism is so often held by institutions, kind of being really resolute about how communities can hold these struggles was really important. And that's something I think a huge takeaway that we took from encountering so many groups across the world. So that was really amazing.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the prompt that you said about slogans and the interpretation of the slogans. And I mean, this is not what I prepared. Just disclaimer, I woke up at 4 a.m. to get here. So if I go, you tell me agüita if I'm like just going off front and off topic. But thinking just about this prompt, like the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about Latin American feminisms is this well-known slogan of "Ni una más" or "Ni una menos." And I don't know if anybody here has heard it, but it literally translates: "Ni una más" is not any one more, and "Ni una menos" is not any one less. And the thing is, these are slogans that have been alive in campaigns in Latin America for decades. And I grew up actually hearing more the ni una más all the time. Ni una más is not one more dead, not one more dead sister, mother, neighbor, niece, daughter. But then the one that actually, it sort of merged into this ni una menos, which is more, I feel like it's so much more active because it's not one less. We're not saying that we don't want one more dead. We're saying we don't want anyone else to disappear. We are here and you're not taking any of us again. And if you touch one of us, you touch all of us. And I think those are one of like the most the most important slogans that actually go across all of Latin American feminisms. And then the other one that I think really encapsulates a lot of the most well-known fights in like feminist fights in Latin America is the one that says nuestro cuerpo es nuestro primer territorio de defensa. Because we talk about decolonializing Latin America all the time, but nuestro cuerpo es nuestro primer territorio de defensa literally means our body is our first territory of defense. Because we're trying to decolonize our countries, to gain rights, to gain freedom, but actually sometimes the fight is so close home that the first thing that we need to defend is our own bodies because the state is there out for us. And this is what like seems to be a connecting thread throughout Latin American feminisms, that the fight starts from here. And one of the biggest like well-known sort of connecting threads is the fight for the right to abortion, to save legal and free abortion in Latin America. And you may all, or maybe not, many of you may have heard of Marea Verde, so the green tide in Latin America. You can raise your hand if you have. Okay, maybe we'll explain it. So this is what I had prepared to explain because I know that not everybody has the same sort of approach to Latin American feminist movements like we do because we are in them. So I'm just going to explain a little bit. Would it make more sense to speak first about transnationalism and then we dive into that, actually?
I think it's interesting like what you were bringing to table in terms of like where the or slogans are born, right? Like and how do they tie to the historicity of the territories as well? I feel like so like in the like first off, because translating slogans is really difficult on the side of language. Jiyan Azadî, I feel like people don't even know how to pronounce it in the first time when they start reading it, or the Ni una menos slogan or nuestro territorio is like it's really like it's used as foreign language, but also it is a foreign context to understand in the background, right? And what you've said about like we do not want one more to disappear has also like the disappearances in the context of it has a whole background and history to what it means, like this collective memory for the Muslims. So I think like that was like an interesting thing to table. I guess like I will be interesting to talk a bit about like how then can you translate this historicity when you're like doing transnational politics. So if you want to bring it a bit into like
yeah, I think that would be quite useful because I think if we talk about like transnational feminisms and solidarity across movements, it can be in so many different facets and with so many different causes. But at the end of the day, the fights are all very specific to their context, but there are common threads. There is like defense of our bodies, of our life, and the demands that we have a right to a dignified life. So yeah, like I can explain a little bit about the green tide, but I don't know if it fits with the whole conversation because this is what I had prepared myself because I knew I would be very tired and going off branches. So I was just going to explain this big example, which is the green tide in Latin America, and are the campaigns for aborto legal, seguro y gratuito, which is free, safe, and legal abortion. These campaigns are widespread because Latin America is still the region with the highest number of countries with the most restrictive legislation around access to abortion. So maybe some of you have heard about the Compass from Argentina, who, after many, many years of legal challenges and new legislation proposals, finally managed to get abortion legalized on the 29th of December of 2020, so just barely 2 years ago, which was a huge success for so many of us, and it marked a change in the psyche of a lot of Latin American pro-choice activists. And it sort of showed that if we really fought for things, we could achieve great change. Previous to 2020, the only two countries where it was legal to have an abortion in Latin America until 12 weeks were Uruguay, which legalized it in 2012, and Cuba, which legalized it in 1965. Everywhere else, it was highly restricted or totally banned under every circumstance. It fills me with joy to share that it's now been 1 month and 4 days since this has now changed in Mexico. Mexico now allows also free, safe, and legal abortion in the whole of the country, and it's a massive achievement. Especially because, like, I'm from Chile, a country where abortion was banned under every circumstance in 1990. And I'm sure that, and it was only legalized partially in 2017. And this is something that if there's anybody here that has any connection with Ireland, probably can feel the sort of struggle that it is that you have no option, no choice but to fight there. But the important thing and the reason why I'm bringing legislations into the table is because they looked great to put in the news. But none of these changes, none of these absolute basic rights came from the ether. All of these came from campaigns on the ground that have worked for years, for decades, providing alternative routes to women and to pregnant people, talking to people, convincing, fighting to defend each other, providing backstreet routes to abortions, safe ones, and just trying to give support to each other. So there were decades of socorristas in Argentina, of campaigns to make misoprostol easily available in pharmacies, or to providing it through alternative methods. There were years of supporting one another to just them in the basic right to choose our own destiny. There were, for example, in El Salvador, the campaign for the Las 17 más, the 17 and more, which is a great example of where international abroad was made, because for many years, due to the draconian absolute ban, many women who have had complications on their pregnancies have been sent to prison under, being called murderers for 30, 40 years. So we've seen that there have been, the reason why I'm bringing this is because abortion is a unifying theme in Latin America, where we've seen steps forwards and steps backwards. And we look in awe and we're like, oh, what are our countries doing that? But then suddenly you can reflect into Europe, and you can reflect into the global north, and you can start thinking, what is happening here? Because we thought that we had those rights. Because we thought that abortion had been legalized in the UK, and suddenly people are being persecuted. Because we thought that abortion was legal in the US, and suddenly people are being rounded up. Because our Polish comrades 7 years ago started kicking up a fuss. And it's been 7 years and things haven't gotten better. So I think that's when we start seeing that actually none of these issues are just single issues that happen isolated in one place. These are all things that are interconnected. And with each win, we change the balance of the international policy, of how we see the movements. If one wins, then maybe we get a little bit more helpful that things can change here too. But when you get an overturn of Roe versus Wade, suddenly you get a massive March for Life, an anti-choice March for Life going down in London, calling hundreds of people to ban the right to choose. And that's one of the actions that Fala has been involved in, and that's one that I'm gonna let Anai talk about, because you were much more involved in it.
Yeah, thanks for that's good. That's good. I think I guess just to also set up like a bit of the timing and the rhythm of the conversation because we as women always try to accelerate ourselves to like make spaces more. So like just take the time to express and talk slowly if you can. If I talk too slow or like if it's too fast, it's so fast. When I'm nervous or tired, I get on the Chilean rhythm. I know. We are also trying to attempt to resume decades of struggles in different territories into a single panel. So that's also like a recognition of like what are we holding on our backs. I guess like there are like many things that have been brought in the table, right? Like we've been talking a bit about like how do we where do our movements come and like how through a slogan and through key historical moments we build really strategic declarations and like I guess like Philippe was talking about like conscious declarations and understanding. So what do we want for the future, right? When we are saying not one last thing, we are saying change and Azadî, like that is the movement declaring its intentions and it's a movement looking forward. And I guess we were talking a bit about as well about like what does it mean to have a dialogue between movements and like how does that feel like on a personal level as well as on a political level, and how can that like then spark like new ways of organizing or actually reprioritizing our work within the UK, and how do we then bring that back home and how do we like reverberate that within our own territory, right? So I guess like we are going a bit on that direction. We're waving those links. Also, I think you've mentioned the relevance of like doing these politics and taking feminist politics seriously, not only considering the whole background of history and just like the reconfiguration of power dynamics within movements in the last couple of years, but also understanding our relationship with patriarchal spaces, which I feel like maybe is also something that we want to touch on a bit more, being in this space, or like why is it necessary then to even centering women's politics? So just on that invitation, just like thinking a bit as well, like how do we bring back things home when things are like so big? How do we then tie them back to our own reality?
Yeah, I guess there's this, I guess when you're working as a group that is kind of like rooted in the diaspora, there's always this movement going from like global to local, right? So it becomes really important, like internationalism becomes like woven into how we organize our politics. And so our work here in the UK is as much about advocating for migrant rights as it is about kind of like being really honest and really active about the struggles in our territories where we come from, and thinking really seriously about how where we are right now, kind of in the nexus of power, how things that are going on here are directly affecting our compañeros back in our home territories. And so I think this movement between like being conscious of the fact that we're like a migrant community living in the UK facing really specific struggles, but also that we're like sitting in the crib of like colonialism where all of the power is held, that then goes and impacts our families and communities back home. That movement already, I think, already kind of speaks to what you're talking about. It's like, what does it mean to bring all of this experience here? And that's why I mentioned this importance about being really, like, yeah, taking seriously, I guess, the struggles and political histories that you bring with you when you migrate. And I think so this invitation to talk about transnational and internationalism, I think to us, it speaks of this movement back and forth. And it's really key is to how we envision Fallah's politics and how we look to build power and resistance, because transnationalism is inherently, like, I guess, this movement towards decentralizing imperialist countries from the way we do politics and not letting them kind of define the narratives of liberation and social justice, which at times includes also being critical on ourselves and how we've also kind of taken on these like narratives of social justice that are Western centric. And to us, I guess, like, working transnationally really is at the heart of it. It makes us leave our struggles together and not in competition with each other, and seeing how the struggles that we face as migrants in the UK and in their specificity linked to the struggles faced across Latin America. I'm Bolivian, Margaret's Chilean. Our assembly holds like experiences from across Avia Yala, all distinct and very specific. But I think seeing the links between the struggles of our very specific communities here and back home, I think that is transnational feminism at work. And I think seeing how those struggles connect in these really like key ways is a key to building a stronger collective foundation to resist capitalist, imperialist, patriarchal oppression, which are all already working at a transnational level. So actually like, I think for this movement to work and for feminism to actually get anywhere, we need to be operating transnationally, which is why I think the Kurdish women's movement and the proposition of democratic confederalism is so important, because it's building the framework so that feminist movements can start operating at the level that all of these crazy power structures are already operating in and have been doing for years. So yeah, that's again like a huge takeaway from this interaction that we've had.
Thanks. And do you want to come in?
I mean, that's actually a really big question. In a way that, you know, a lot of the struggles we're talking about, and particularly in the case of Kurdistan, and if you're not in Kurdistan, there is the struggle, you know, perhaps in this case from Britain, which includes sometimes doing lobbying, includes trying to build awareness, political education initiatives, fighting the criminalization of our movements. And there's that of what's happening here, but then there's of course also a direct connection to the impacts of your land being under occupation and it being invaded and there being an active war. And I think it's sometimes quite hard to reconcile what it means to bring it home in a way. And of course, it's very difficult to sometimes, I guess, almost feel satisfied by those efforts. But one of the approaches that the Kurdish movement has and the Kurdish women's movement is, when Kurdish migration, I guess, started to Europe as a whole, particularly, when it intensified in the 80s and then in the 90s in the 80s, particularly from South Kurdistan because of, the massacre, the Anfal, genocidal Anfal campaign in Iraq and the Halabja massacre and so on. And then, of course, also in 1978, the Marash massacre in the 90s when the Turkish state was, burning entire villages and towns to the ground. So the migration to Europe and, which of course included the UK, at that time felt and was it was thought of as very temporary by, our communities. And the idea was that, there is a fight, there's going to be, and then freedom will come and we all go back home. And so sometimes it's interesting when, the far right say, go back to where you came from. And it's like, yeah, we kind of want to actually, but, your states also won't stop supporting the people who are committing a genocide against us. So, so for a while it was, it was understood as, okay, we're here as temporary. So we're a temporary migrant, we are temporary like migrant community kind of crossing into becoming a diaspora. But I think one of the shifts actually when what is called by the Kurdish movement of a paradigm shift, when there was like the official shift to democratic confederalism and that vision being the struggle of the Kurdish freedom movement, was also understanding that, of course, there's millions of Kurdish people all across Europe, all across the world. And many of them, even if, Kurdistan was free tomorrow, they have established roots now that they're unlikely to uproot, themselves, their kids, their whole communities, and necessarily go back and really settle back home. So how do we organize ourselves outside of our homeland? And so a part of democratic confederalism is the local organizing everywhere we are. So not just establishing that as a system in Kurdistan, but also organizing as assemblies, as communes, as and within and autonomous women's structures everywhere we are. And actually, the first autonomous women's assembly was actually founded by Kurdish women in Germany before it was actually founded in Kurdistan. Some of the first attempts at democratic confederalism were happening by the diaspora or more the Kurdish communities in Europe. And so so therefore part of bringing that home is organizing ourselves wherever we are, and therefore also, you know, using the opportunity of being in this case the, you know, the belly of the beast, of also connecting with other struggles, other communities, other understanding, learning other methods of struggle, you know, whether it's Women Within Future conferences that, you know, have already mentioned, or other ways that we have connected before. We learn from each other, you know, like from, I guess, more basic sounding things like exchanges of, you know, you know, how, you know, some of our comrades in Abiyala refer to spaces like territories rather than country, or like, you know, these kind of things, or understanding certain methods or articulations of struggle. Like, you know, there was a very massive exchange between, you know, the Kurdish women's movement and, you know, women's movements in Latin America, of conceptualizing what can be understood as feminicide, for example, and how to struggle against that, but also how to struggle for the recognition of that. And obviously other exchanges as well, for example, like, you know, autonomous women's struggle, but also not in a sectarian sense, where it's not cut off from the rest of society, but how do we organize ourselves autonomously that is also necessarily integrated and sees itself as like a vehicle of the transformation of the whole of society, rather than, you know, separating women from the rest of society and creating these like very isolationist spaces. So how do we do that? How do we see our struggle also as the struggle of whole of society? And these have already happened. And, you know, this is also part of why I talk about co-optation, is co-optation of Jiyan Azadî isn't like some of these, like, I don't know, liberal either MPs or like these crazy multinational companies like plastering Jiyan Azadî on their whatever, like ad campaigns or whatever they call it. Or, you know, MPs who are also complicit in the criminalization of the Kurdish movement, cutting bits of their hair off in the European Parliament or whatever. But it's not just that. It's not just obviously the words being co-opted. It's a complete disrespect and a disregard for already the years of struggle and the years of like interaction between women's struggle as well. And also not understanding that Jiyan Azadî was also always meant to be a universal declaration, a universal political declaration. The Kurdish women's movement has never been precious about it, but it's very, very protective over what that means, because that slogan has also quite literally been developed by that political declaration. It's quite literally developed by blood, sweat, and tears of thousands of women that have come before us. And I just want to very quickly say this, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit more if we have time. But the Kurdish women's movement, the Kurdish movement, and not just Kurdish people, but all the peoples of northeast Syria, like Rojava and also parts of Turkey, are under grave attack right now. You know, when we talk about Jiyan Azadî being a political declaration, it's also important to understand that that political declaration is a call to action, to every single person who cares about freedom. Like when we talk about this slogan, it's also in the context of people being bombed and killed every single day and lives being lost. So I also don't, you know, obviously conversations are important, but it's also important that we understand that when we're sitting here and when we're also understanding certain ideas more, that as much as possible, we also understand it as a call to action to ourselves. And that we've seen, for example, in 2019, when Turkey invaded Rojava, that people taking to the streets and standing steadfast with the people of Rojava, with the people who sacrificed 11,000 martyrs to territorially defeat ISIS, that Turkey had to withdraw, or Turkey had to stop its invasion. So what we do here, even though sometimes it feels dire, it's not easy, and it probably won't be easy for a long time, and it will be a long struggle, but it's something that we have to do all together. it's a struggle that we have to be in all together to understand that also Kurdistan right now is not the only place that there's struggle, but it's a very, very crucial battleground in the capitalist modernity trying to reestablish itself and stamp its mark on the 21st century. I think it's important to understand that there are, of course, many places of struggle, but there are certain places that the system that we're fighting against is using as a way to rubber stamp its power on literally the rest of the century. And the rest of the century, that might also mean, not to be like super doomers, I'm actually, anyways, it is also the reality. This rest of the century that might also see literally our like earth die. So I think it's very important for us to understand that there is a very beautiful struggle that I think gives all of us hope, and that gives all of us joy. There is a lot of joy in it too, but it also requires action by many of us, because otherwise, well, firstly, we might not have an earth to even live on, but the people that we're talking about who have developed this against so many odds, they might not be here if we don't also stand with them. And I think that's really important, because while the Kurdish movement was fighting against ISIS, it also at the same time said women's struggle has been sidelined so many times in many revolutionary resistances. We are going to make sure that doesn't happen this time. We are going to be establishing our alternative system while we are also fighting against the enemy of humanity. And yeah, I mean, there is so much to say, but I'll just leave it there, because it's very hard to like also be seeing the news at the moment, but I think it's also very important that we understand that there is a place, there is a struggle and a place we can like stand with, that hopefully will mean a win for the kind of ideas and the kind of vision, the kind of system that we want to see in the world.
Thanks. I guess like I do want to get a bit deeper on like what does it mean to have the ambition? I think someone put that word into today. What is ambition to develop a global movement or organize a global movement on a global scale? And what does it mean to organize in an autonomous structure, like as a feminist structure? And also understand our struggle as a struggle of everyone, and as a struggle for all society, right? Because I think in the last, like since 2018 to 2010, we saw a massive eruption of the feminist movement coming into into playing as a political actor, into playing in many territories. I know that we didn't saw this in the UK. But just saying at France, Italy, Spain, at Poland, and Argentina, and Mexico, we saw millions and millions of women going into the streets, talking around what it meant to have a feminist strike and putting on an alternative into the types of politics that we could be making, right? And they were doing that, talking about feminicide. They were doing that, talking about reproductive rights. They were doing that. Talking about what does it mean to fight for your own territory. But they were also doing that, and I think like it has put a challenge to the traditional left, or the traditional way that the left has understood the political terrain, not only tapping into what it means to strike from reproductive work, and what does it mean to strike from work that is invisible to the traditional unions, but also it has put a challenge and a fight that it is impossible to not recognize here today. Like it has literally changed the way that we speak about politics, and it has actually built a global movement that now has a new type of discourse. It has a new type of narrative. I guess like that is why for me, like it is really important to be talking about transnational feminism and what does that even mean for us, like after this new wave of putting things on the way. So I think I want to talk a bit about like what does it mean to organize movement like globally as a feminist structure, and that talks to everybody.
I think those are loads of different questions, because you mentioned what does it mean to build a transnational movement, but also what does it mean to challenge the ways in which the left has traditionally organized. And the phrase that comes to mind is this one of feminization of politics, or thinking of making politics in a different way. And I don't know if this was touched upon or not in a session that was earlier about caring, because I couldn't make it, but it sort of looked like it looked up about like the way in which we care about each other. But I think that is something that that a lot of feminist movements have been challenging. In which way do we do politics? From the ground, and therefore, once we get from the ground into the institutions, can we challenge that? Is there a way of challenging that? Because the example that comes to mind for me is I worked with lots of Central American activists, and a lot of them were from Nicaragua. And I used to work in solidarity campaigns with like El Salvador and Nicaragua, and a lot of them were Sandinistas. And if you are vaguely familiar with Sandinismo and all of the liberation wars in Latin America, there was a lot of CIA involved. There was a lot of, it was messy, it was not nice. But in Nicaragua, they managed to hold on to power with the revolution. But the problem was, and this is sisters that have told me that were there, was that they would constantly get the sister, we can't do this now. We first need to achieve the revolution, and then things will change. And then gets repeated and repeated and repeated. And being a leftist doesn't mean that you're not sexist. Being on the left doesn't mean that you don't carry the patriarchy here and the pride here. It doesn't mean that. And I think what a lot of feminist movements in Latin America have been working very hard on is on challenging that. I mean, like, politics is not happening without us, not anymore. And it's not that it doesn't go unchallenged, but things have been changing, and there's more and more talks about what does it mean to have politics of care, politics that are different, politics in which if you end up going into some sort of position of power, even if it's just in a trade union movement, you don't have to actually act and behave in like traits of traditional toxic masculinity in order to be heard. But you also don't have to behave on a traditional feminine role in order to be treated as a woman. So there's all sorts of challenges and pulls and push happening. And I think that's quite interesting. And that's it translates different in every movement. But I don't think the feminist movement is getting away. It's letting the mainstream politics get away with putting the women struggles in the back burner anymore, which I think is a great thing. And now, and just very briefly about like transnationalisms and like what does it mean to like connect locally and like internationally. I can just speak from ourselves as being diasporas. Like I left Chile when I was growing up. I've lived in Europe. My heart is in one place and in another. And inevitably, my politics are going to be linked to the local of where I am and linked to the international of where I'm from. And it's a constant everyday struggle to bring those together in a way that is cohesive and in which you honor both. You honor the local fights as a migrant woman, but you also honor the histories that you have inherited and that you bring with you. And how can you honor them from here, expand them, show them, but also fight for all the things whilst here, because your story is like here, there, and everywhere. So I don't know if you want to expand a little bit more on what that means to you, but it's a constant struggle, but it means that we're learning from each other all the time. That when we get together and we hear each other's stories, we find solace on what we can identify with. We learn from each other. We challenge our views. We think, okay, so maybe this is working there. Maybe this can be reapplied here. Maybe not. It's a constant struggle. It's a constant learning from each other, but it's also a constant being like, different things are moving forward. There's hope. We have to have hope. I'm saying this more like as somebody who always has hopes, even in like the face of adversity, because I always think that hope is a responsibility. And I mean, it's easy for me to say it because I'm in a fairly comfortable position living in the UK. Like I'm quite safe, but sometimes there are days that you get up and you're like, what is going on in the world? Like there's a climate emergency happening, and like we're in a ever-growing fascist state. I'm a migrant woman living in this country. Why am I here? And then I feel like we have a responsibility if we have the capacity at that point, because days are as they come. But if we have a responsibility of try to find that hope, to try to continue building a future that we can actually hold on and build something better. Because the system around us is telling us all the time that that's not possible. And we're here to fight and show them that that's wrong. Okay.
I mean, I think I just echo whatever, like everything that Marga has shared, that I agree with a lot. But I also think there's something about, I think what feels relevant to bring into focus here is like the 8th of March. And I think this like really symbolic date. And I think it's really symbolic, but because it happened in Latin America in 2018, there was like general strikes called, and there was a general strike. People like stopped all paid and unpaid work, right? And that was huge because being in this territory where with such a long history of like labor organizing, they've like treated this proposition, that women and marginalized genders might also need to strike from paid and unpaid work with extreme skepticism. Speaking as someone that has connections with the Women's Strike Assembly, it's not, it was really difficult to engage people in these conversations around like, what does it mean to bring a feminist strike to a country like the to a territory like the UK that has such a long history and really knows what that word means. But suddenly when you're asking them to change the context of where that work is placed, I think it does what Marga said, which it challenges where politics happens. And I think for us, it's really interesting because that has like a pretty strong correlation with what was going on back home, which was a demand that this kind of social reproduction is taken really seriously as a part of the movement, and this demand that it is not like a fringe part of the revolution, but rather needs to be made really central to the way politics happen. And that was really important to bring with us to this context, because suddenly we could speak really specifically to a place that has such a long history in organizing strikes, but organizing strikes that happen where men are organized and the women are still expected to carry out all of the unpaid and unrecognized social reproductive duties at home and everywhere else. And so I think kind of every year we go out to the streets, obviously for many different reasons, because of femicide, because of state-sanctioned violence against women, marginalized genders, and migrants. But it means a lot to stand like kind of shoulder to shoulder with your sisters every year on the 8th of March. It feels like sometimes I think even the feminist movement here questions like, oh, do we have to do it again? Like we've got so much low capacity. But I think there's like a huge symbolic power in doing it. And I think Veronica Gago has like a really nice term for it, like la potencia feminista, this feeling that like sometimes when like Margaret describes, like you have this feeling that like, yeah, can I do it anymore? What is even the point? But I think knowing that somewhere out there, there's someone struggling just as you are, there's feeling just as you are, knowing that they are winning things and they are struggling, you should feel that reverberation and that echo. And there is no better time to feel it than like on a day like the 8th of March, where you know that across the world, thousands of women, even if it's only a couple hundred of us in London every year, we're sitting alongside thousands of women who are struggling with us. And that should fuel us, that should put fire in our bellies to keep going. Because la potencia feminista is the desire to change everything. It's the unrealized desire of things that are not yet, but could be and might be.
Yeah, I guess like we've come to like an hour of the conversation. For anyone wondering, this is how dinner is also look like for us. So I think like this was like a continuous of a dialogue. This started like a year ago. It's a continuous dialogue between movements, between contexts and between politics. And I guess like I also wanted to open up to the floor, maybe for people to like ask questions, like for anything that brings up to you. I think we've been talking a bit about like the historical context, the political context, the type of proposals and transformations that are being built and that are being put on the table. We've been talking over I think we've touched very briefly over like the hope and the joy of the movement, and also on the criminalization and like setback of the states. And I think we've touched very briefly on that. Maybe want to go more on to go and relate. But yeah, we've been like going on and over these questions. We've also discussed a bit on like how do we bring things back home, and in which conditions, and from which position, and in which situation. And yeah, I guess like if anyone is like interested in like bringing anything to the room, it's just an open conversation. So does anyone, can I see like hands maybe for people that has urgent needs? Okay. Nice. So I see 3 hands at the moment.
Mentioned northeast Syria. You mentioned northeast Syria, and in the context of the paragraph on title history, Kurdistan is seen not a country, whereas Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan are. What I'm sort of interested to know is how what you can say about the situation with regard to the last project. On behalf of the church, what I found is that like that.
So can you clarify the question a bit more? What do you mean by the US occupying on behalf of the Kurdish people?
They're occupying some oil wells in northern Syria. North Syria is the only part which not been taken back by Syrian.
Well, that's also not true because Turkey occupies other parts of Syria as well, and so do other jihadi groups. So that's also not, that's factually incorrect.
If one of the parts, I'm interested.
Okay, is there a question in the contribution?
I'm interested in how feminists in Palestine relate to this situation. Syria, and transnational, word transnational. Another meaning for international film, but it's like to see that part of Syria, part of the Islam.
No, so I think I think I'll respond to this separately because I imagine the rest of the questions will be a slightly different tone. So I think this is a very important point because there seems to be this quite, I guess the good faith way to describe it is this like quite old school anti-imperialism, but also I think it's interesting what sometimes where we get our historical references from, right? In terms of Syria was created 100 years ago, and Syria was created, as a result partly of carving up Kurdistan. So dividing the Kurdish people into 4 nation states: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Now, Kurdistan as a nation state, as recognized by the United Nations, by the US, by NATO, or whatever structure that I imagine you are probably quite critical of, does not exist. But Kurdistan is a territory. It is a territory which is inhabited by Kurdish people, but also met by many other peoples. One of the beauties of this alternative vision is that one territory can be understood as home by many people. The same place that some people understand as Kurdistan is also for some people, also home to Armenians, home to Assyrians, home to Assyriacs, home to many, many other communities that also are very integral to the project and to the alternative that has been developed in northeast Syria. And I think when it particularly comes to the occupation of Syria and, the interesting point that it hasn't been taken by Assad yet, we need to understand this. Assad is a genocidal dictator. He has the blood of millions of people, thousands, tens of thousands of Kurdish people on his hand. This was the case long before ISIS came around. This was the case long before the 2011 uprisings. Also also partly of his own people, right? In 2003, when the Patriotic Union Party, the PYD, one of the Kurdish parties, was created, about a year later, coaches of Kurdish people were taken from parts of Damascus to be disappeared forever, never to be seen. So I think it's very important to understand the context. And also, when Syria was first created, just like in Turkey, there was a Turkification for official strategy of the Turkish state, a Turkification process to annihilate any existence, any expression of the Kurdish people. The current Bashar al-Assad's father also had something called the Arab Belt policy, which was that Kurdish people did not have the right to citizenship. They had very, very basic identification, and that was just a surveillance method. Very, very basic identification. They could barely buy cars. Well, you can buy cars, but Syria has this interesting system where you buy the car and the number plate separately. So they could buy a car, but then they couldn't drive it because to get a number plate registered, you need proper identification, and the Kurdish people did not have identification. They couldn't buy land. They couldn't work in many jobs. Actually, I was in Jerusalem earlier this year, and this Palestinian artist that I met said, "Oh, I went to this alternative art school. This alternative art school, and I had a Kurdish art teacher, and he was so amazing. And I went to study with him because, he wasn't allowed to teach in the state university because he didn't have identification, so he couldn't get a job, for example." And so it's very important to understand the context of things. Now, when it comes to the situation of the US presence in Syria, this is not something that is welcomed with full hearts by the Kurdish people. But unfortunately, right now, it's a necessity because, as we saw in 2019, the only reason, unfortunately, that there wasn't a full-blown genocide when Turkey did a ground invasion was the presence of US troops. Now, if all of us, and I imagine, people like yourself as well, if we stood with the Kurdish people, if we stood with the people who are trying to create a better Syria, they don't even have the claims for an independent Kurdistan or carving up Syria. They have said many times that they are ready to be in talks with Assad for a federal and democratic Syria, where there can be democratic elections, where if he wants, he can run an election too, and the people of Syria can choose. They have declared this vision many, many times. Assad refuses to talk to them. So this is very important to understand. These talks would mean that the US is forced to leave Syria as well, because there would be a future democratic process for Syria. And this is what the Kurdish forces, and not just the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Council. Now, at this point, in terms of sheer numbers, there's actually more Arabs in the Syrian Democratic Council than the Kurdish people. So it's a very mixed, very pluralistic structure. And it's very interesting how we focus on, the invasion of the occupation of the US on behalf of the Kurds, as though Kurds are some alien people to these lands. They are indigenous peoples to these lands, like many other people. And of course, we do not want US presence in these lands. This is a very clear stance. It has never not been. But we also need to make sure that the withdrawal of the US does not result in a genocide. So I welcome all of us to work together to make this happen. I welcome all of us to write to our MPs, to write to anyone who we think can actually impact policy, to recognize some level of political status for Northeast Syria, so therefore they can take their rightful place in a negotiation for what a future Syria can look like for all the people in Syria. And I think this is what the Kurdish movement has said for many, many years. This is its vision for Turkey, just like it's not calling for an independent Kurdistan cut off from, like the southeast Turkey cut off from Turkey. It's also calling for a federal Turkey. And just to be clear, the Kurdish movement is not in the market of creating new borders. What it wants to do is deem the current artificial and imperialist borders obsolete. Thank you.
I'm thinking about the reasons we migrate, and I totally relate with what you say about go back to a control I wish. And I'm thinking about, right, the reasons we migrate and the invisible wars in Latin America, but also the potential of invisible numbers from killings of Kurdish people and how we can build these connections between movements. And also, I would love to hear from you, from the panel, the challenges of building connections, not only between these movements, but especially with the local movements in the UK, and how we could potentially overcome these challenges.
Yeah, just thinking about everything that you're saying today, it's an education what you give, well, what you're giving me anyway today. But what practical ways can we support, whether it be as an individual, whether it be as a union member, whether it be as a trade council member, and just generally, how can we support you, and in what ways can we do it?
Hi, this is more of a vague question and it calls back to quite early in the panel when you were speaking about how there's progress and pushback in the feminist movement. And you referenced the experience of making progress in Latin America, but then very soon after witnessing like restrictions in the West. And I was very interested in how the restrictions that we're experiencing in the West now gradually with like sort of policing reproductive rights, kind of shutting down safe health areas, etc. As in England, colonial kind of heart of colonialism, how that affects, like how is that perceived by people who are in these colonized places, trying to get the rights that they are seeing being pulled back in these colonizing nations. I don't know if that makes much sense. I'm very tired.
Potentially slightly off topic here, context is slightly different. How is feminism trying to attract more men, especially with the recent rise of right-wing machoism? I shall not mention the name, but the initials of AT, I'm sure everyone knows. It almost feels like a counter to the feminist movement. And is there anything within feminism to fight this? And because these are young men that are disenfranchised, and they're the future of patriarchy. They're the oppressors of women. Is there anything that feminism wants to sort of get in the youth of men, and maybe better men for the future?
Nice. Thanks for those questions. So I guess like we have like very similar energies coming from the public. You think there is questions over like how do we build or what are the challenges of building connections with local movements in the UK? Like there are asked for knowing like what practical ways of organizing, feminist organizing can we give as examples. And I guess like also on these reflections there is another question on like what observing like the new wave of restrictions and assault to women's rights in the West, and a new attack on like feminism on the rise of the far right. So I guess like those are the two type of lines to reply to. I'm just going to pass the mic to anyone.
I mean, I drafted and I'm not sure I have the answers, but first of all, before actually I reply any of those questions, I just wanted to say it'd be good to never really ever question the existence of a nation, like in a territory. I come from the south of Chile. If anybody here were to like question the existence of the Walmapu, we'd have a serious talk out there. So let's start by that. Let's start by having a bit of a thought before we speak. So talking about ways of connecting with the local, I think it's a constant struggle because obviously, yeah, it's a story of the migrant heart, isn't it? You're half here, you're half there, or are you fully duplicated in two places at the same time? Some days you get up and you're like a citizen of the world, and some days you get up and you're from nowhere. But I mean, I think finding spaces in which you can work with people from diaspora is one way of connecting with what is it that affects those realities and what are those realities? Because the reality for a lot of migrant people is that when we migrate, our life circumstances tend to get harder. Being a migrant is not easy. You have no support network. You very much like, unless you get a good job and you migrate because you have a good job out there, you're very likely going to have to look for different jobs that is not what your previous experience is tied in with. Or if you are second or third generation migrant, people may be like, there's all sorts of biases and discrimination. We know that by now. So some of that is like, okay, so if we are all workers and we're struggling and our migrant story is like of a struggle, where is that? A lot of it is in the workplace. And I know that some people here are involved in organizing with migrant workers, and that's been a good, like, I think a very effective place of working in solidarity between migrant struggles and the trade union movement. And I think that's, some unions have been quite effective at working around those issues and actually moving from this traditional, more like migrant work. I'm really sorry to say this, but there are trade unionists still, and there were back in the day a lot of trade unions that would be like, well, migrant workers actually do put a stress in our workforce because, you know, they're not unionized and then therefore they may take lower paid wages, so not necessarily supporting those struggles. And actually doing that intersection then, that's a good way of collaborating. But then as women, it's like, okay, so where do the women work? And actually, how do we work on those struggles? And I think it looks different for everybody. Like feminism is not one type of feminism. There's loads of types of feminisms, which leads to the other about like, sorry, my brain is now hooked into like trade unions are like, what can men can do? Like I think about like men on the left mostly, and it's not for me to answer that really. I mean, there's loads of ways in which people are challenging toxic masculinities and are challenging patriarchal attitudes, and lots of these men or non-binary but masculine presenting people, and I think that's a work that these people have to do. I can't come and tell you what you have to do in order not to be sexist. I don't think it's my place, but I can be with you if you're my friend, okay? And I can be like, I can call you in instead of call you out because, you know, you're my friend and I don't want to like be like out of the movement now because you've been sexist. I mean, if I didn't know you, maybe I would, it depends on how you catch me, but there's a lot of work that we're all doing because we women are also like, we are born in a patriarchal system. We learn what we see and we reproduce that and we work every day very hard to challenge that, to free ourselves, but also to be like freer with our brothers and sisters and with our siblings. So I think that's something that we all have to work on. And I think it's something that that men need to work on. And I know that there are loads of men working on it and working with young men on masculinity and challenging the rise of the far right. But unfortunately, the far right is rising. And we've got to question, what is it that we're not doing? What conversations are we not having? Because that ties on to what's happening with all of this regression in loads of places in the global north. And what vacuums are we leaving or are being left to the far right? Why is it getting so much traction, and what can we do to organize against that? And community organizing and political organizing is one of those things. Like, these kind of spaces are great, but we need more of that. Sorry, Latina.
I think, going to your question, I think in terms of like building political spaces or like making connections, as we've mentioned, I think a lot of political spaces are patriarchal by design, everywhere really. But even within the feminist movement, I think working within the UK, it's a complete minefield, because a lot of the feminist movement here are TERFs. A lot of the feminist movement here are anti-sex work. Then some other certain feminist movements will be completely kind of like racist. So you're working with like people that, are all working under one umbrella of feminism, but actually there's tons of feminisms. And that's kind of to celebrate the diversity of like the feminisms that we come with. But that's also in recognition of the fact that there's like some very key disagreements that feminism has. And so I think one of the challenges that we face is like thinking about how do we build connections across those differences, and what are our red lines. So I think that's something that's really important. And also I think as a community-led organizing group, it's really important, in the same way that it's like very futile to come and organize as an individual. I think as soon as you create a group, you realize that, actually we need to be working in a coalition. It's not enough to be organizing as a community just by ourselves. We need to now build up and create connections. And I mean, that's been like the most surprising part of community organizing for me, is the fact that actually once you create a network, that network is creating a network, and then that network is creating another network. And that's kind of where the politics is. It's about doing things with the people like in this room, but then being like, who isn't in this room, and how can that happen?
I'm going to just do bullet points for all of them, because in the interest of time, but also, I think in terms of like building connection with local movements in the UK, I think what's important to obviously understand as we are here is the context and the situation that society and societies find themselves in across these isles. So I think that's very important, particularly, from the 80s, obviously this goes back way longer. We could go back as long as like the enclosures or before that, or, obviously when you are the center of a, global empire, that empire also needs quite like significant control over its own population, right? Over its own direct population. So I'm saying this to say that society across Britain has been, across the British Isles, has been under attack for centuries. And, we also know this more recent, as, when Thatcher said there is no society. And I think when we talk about local movements, what we also need to talk about is society and community and how we connect with each other. And, obviously neoliberalism in a way was like the nail in the coffin of all of that. When, for example, how if you still live around, for example, neighbors that you've had for more than, let's say, 5 years, you're considered lucky nowadays, right? And that's as basic as that, although it's not necessarily a basic thing, but to obviously perhaps more like developed political analysis of like the nation state, of capitalism, of patriarchy, of particularly people constantly overworking to literally just be able to live, and so on and so forth. So I think when we talk about local movements, perhaps it's also important to talk about society and how we can see ourselves as perhaps part of like efforts to also rebuild society, and what that could look like in the context of the very dire material realities that many people find themselves across these isles. So I think I won't go on to like thoughts about that because we don't have much time, but I think I just wanted to offer that as, I guess, other things to like think about a little bit. And I think also what can be done, how to support. There's more like, but there's direct things of like, there's things like, the Kurdistan Solidarity Network that is quite easy to search and like, get in touch with and get involved in. There's, if you're a part of a trade union, there is the Freedom for Öcalan trade union campaign that has the affiliation of 14 national trade unions and also, affiliated to by the TUC. And there's been like various things that have done. It was like, the official international campaign of the Durham Miners Gala in 2018. The campaign was at Tolpadur Martyrs Festival in 2019. And there's been other things, but I think there is still a bit of a block into like moving it through to like a general understanding in like either movements of progressive people, the broader labor movement and so on. So I think there's ways to get involved in that. And, also trying to like keep up with news. And when it comes to what's happening in Kurdistan, there is a complete media blackout. Like you just don't hear about it. Like Turkey in the last week has bombed literally every single civilian infrastructure in northeast Syria. Millions of people have no electricity, have no water. Hospitals don't have enough blood for wounded people. People are on the brink of starvation, and you literally will never see it in the news. So I think we need to find ways in like keeping up with that a bit more. There are Kurdish news outlets to keep in touch with. There's Media News. I don't know if it's .com or .net, but I guess you can look that up. In English language, and there's other efforts as well that are happening to try and get some news out there. There's the Rojava Information Center that does really important work in trying to get stuff out there. And just very quickly, I'm not exactly sure when you say feminism, do you mean women or do you mean feminists as in literally everyone that can be a feminist? I think what's important is I don't subscribe to the thing of it's not my duty, it's not my responsibility to be a part of someone else's transformation. That's not how the Kurdish movement or the Kurdish women's movement sees things. But I also think it's important that all of us, whatever gender you may be, you see yourself as having a stake in these efforts. And also, it's easier to see now, like it's a bit more in our face in a quite disturbing way because of, the speed of social media and so on. But the patriarchal indoctrination of young men is literally the foundations of patriarchy. So it's also not a new tactic. It's actually ridiculously an old tactic that there are alternatives to. But part of that means obviously organizing better. Part of that is our own responsibility in turning our spaces into more transformative spaces. Part of that, sometimes also the reality is we can be abolitionist as abolitionist as we want to be. Sometimes it also means the defense of certain spaces and making sure certain spaces are safe, but obviously not in a purist sense. It's not easy to get the balance right. We are often going to make mistakes, and we're often going to be around other people making, whether it's mistakes. But I think there needs to be a balance between understanding every single person as capable of transformation, but also having quite clear values and principles as well, that as much as possible a collective can hold people responsible to. And the method of that, accountability, can change, can look different. And saying this, I can say this in theory, in practice, I don't know if I'm able to do it very well. This is also part of the own work that we do on ourselves, the transformation that we are attempting within ourselves all the time as well. But I just reiterate as a final thing, I think it's very important that everyone sees ourselves as having a stake in the transformation of everyone around us and of ourselves as well. Because, a patriarchal society, not that we necessarily even need to say this, but patriarchy also doesn't serve men. you know? You've got to kill a part of yourself. You've got to be this like bizarre existence to exist in patriarchy. So it's also important that we see, the principles of women's liberation, radical democracy, ecology as beneficial for the whole of society. It's not just for women, although obviously primarily it's meant to, and it is particularly in Kurdistan, but in many parts of the world led by women, but it's not just for women. So yeah, it's not easy, man.
Right, great. Maybe we want to leave it there. We've come to the end. I don't know if anyone has any kind of thoughts to this. I guess we can continue, this is a continuous dialogue. It has been happening for years and will continue to happen. And thanks everyone for coming. We've held this space thanks to the Left Club. We have some flyers here for anyone who wants to see what they've been working on. Fala also have brought some flyers about the political work that they're doing. And yeah, and we are now heading collectively, if you like, to the International Cafe happening in District, which is really interesting continuous conversation on what does it mean to do transnational politics. Thanks everyone.